In this edition of the Retro Wrestling Reviews, we are going to talk about El Santos Farewell that was held on September 12th, 1982, as well as the 2 years leading up to it, because there was a lot of news concerning El Santo, both in and out of the ring, that led to a lot of people wondering when his retirement was coming, because he had been wrestling at that point to close to 40 years. And he was already in his 60s, so there was a lot of talk by that point as to whether or not he was going to retire. This is Fredo Esparza, and before we get to his retirement match, we should probably start with one of the bigger matches in 1980 that involved El Santo. He was already at that point, I believe, 63 years old. At that point in time, he was with the UWA. He was one of the few wrestlers in Mexico that was allowed to work, UWA and EMLL shows in any, really, for any promoter he could work with. It was just a matter of them paying him. That's all that mattered. But he had that type of he was that big of a name where he could work with anyone, and he was splitting his time. And at that point, UWA and EML were not working with each other in 1980. I think that would come along in late 1981. I think actually in December 1981 was when they first had their big show together in Arena, Mexico. But they would kind of once that started to happen, then it kind of became a more regular thing from 81 forward, with EMLL and UWA working together. But on November 2nd, 1980, at the Toreo de Cuatro Caminos, a UWA show was held, and in one of the matches, El Santo teamed up with Blue Demon and Huracan Ramirez, two other legends of Lucha Libre, and they faced a young up-and-coming group of luchadors, a trio that was still not named at that point, that featured El Signo, Negro Navarro, and Tejano. At that point in time, all three of them were just barely starting to team up as a trio. I think at the start of 1980, Negro Navarro was teaming up with Villano Tercero, and El Signo and Tejano were actually challenging for the welterweight title. So they started, I think, UWA around May 1980. They started kind of putting them all together. They would have them in tag matches, and then they had them in a couple of trios matches, just because they had a very similar quality in that they were very aggressive rudos that worked really fast, really just knew the brawling style, really the style that kind of made the El Toreo style at that point. And so they were given this big match in November 2nd, 1980, where they would team up and face this legendary trio of Technicos. During the match, Santo actually suffered what was described as a heart attack or a stroke, and a lot of people were very concerned. There's really like two sides to the story, because a lot of people thought it was a legit health issue, while there were other people who kind of thought he faked, that he had passed out, that he had just faked it. And a lot of people ended up just confirming that he actually did suffer a health issue. I know Negro Navarro, when I spoke to him, said that he knows that was a concern that they had at that point, because what ended up happening was right after that match ended, there was a lot of media and fans who were blaming El Signo, Negro Navarro, and Tejano for how aggressive they were against their opponents, and they kind of blamed them for causing El Santo to suffer the heart attack during the match. And after that, they were given the moniker of the trio, Los Misioneros de la Muerte, the Death Missionaries, just because they nearly sent El Santo to an early grave. And they, like Negro Navarro said, I interviewed him about, I think, 4 years ago probably, and he was talking about how that match pretty much made them. They became a star trio, really the trio that kind of developed the whole. They were really the first trio that, when the boom in Mexico of trios came about, they were the first ones that really brought attention to that. Later on, they were followed up with Los Villanos, Los Brazos, Trio Fantasia, and all these other trios, Infernales. But they were really the first ones that were credited with the trios boom. And it really came from this match in 1980 against El Santo. And a lot of fans and the media, like I said, just made it seem like they were like the most villainous trio ever. And Negro Navarro in interviews, and he said this in in the interview that I did with him, but he also did it in several interviews after that match. Talked about how they were three young guys who were very aggressive in their style, and he kind of felt that now, knowing now what they were doing as far as being aggressive, that perhaps they shouldn't have been so aggressive with such older luchadors. And on the one hand, you had three guys pretty much establishing themselves as the next stars. And you also kind of started having this talk among fans and media from that point forward for about a year, wondering when El Santo was going to announce his retirement, because they were very concerned about his health at that point. And it ended up, Santo really never brought it up. There was constant talk about it. He kind of disappeared. He would wrestle sporadically in 1981. I think he took a few months off, but then he kind of came back and wrestled maybe a few times during the year. And what ended up happening was El Santo actually had another career that was starting in 1981, and that was he was becoming an escape artist, an escapist, very similar to Harry Houdini. He had trained and was working this escape act with the magician that was known as Yale, and he was doing all sorts of basically any escapist trick that you might have seen or heard about from Harry Houdini or other magicians from past, present, future, whatever magicians you might have heard of. El Santo was doing those, and he actually got a lot of it became a very popular act. He made it onto numerous theaters during 1981. In early 1982, he made his debut at one of the more renowned theaters in Mexico that was called the Teatro Blanquita. But the other thing that was very interesting is that he would actually have wrestlers would attend the shows to see him do the escapist act. Guys like Pedro Aguayo, Coloso Colosetti, Karloff Lagarde, Cesar Valentino, Dientes Hernandez, the Mendozas, the Villanos, you name it, everybody attended these shows, and it became very popular with a lot of fans. And that was really what was his main focus from, I would guess, mid 1981 all the way through early 1982. And as he was doing these shows, you would constantly hear whispers about when he was going to announce his retirement. Nothing ever came about it. He basically stayed quiet. It kind of became more of a buzz amongst the fans. Like, when is this going to happen? And they were hoping he would actually do something that would actually be official, just because there was a lot of talk that he was just gonna. El Santo actually mentioned in an interview prior to his farewell match that he had actually planned on just retiring quietly and not doing more. But one of the people that was working with him on these shows, on these escape artist shows, suggested that he really owed it to the fans to give them one last farewell. He ended up doing that. And he actually ended up doing 3 shows during 1982, from about, I think, August 1982 all the way through September 1982. He did 3 shows. And what's interesting is that if you look at the first 2 shows, it didn't really seem that he was really planning on doing this, because they weren't really even like big. He wasn't even like the main event or the focus of it. It kind of just felt like he was just part of a tournament. Oddly enough, that's what it was. The first 2 shows that he was in that were kind of part of this retirement tour were pretty much just tournament matches. He did one in August 22nd, 1982 at the Palacio de los Deportes for the UWA promotion. He teamed up with El Solitario and actually wrestled Rocambole and Villano Tercero. They lost the match, and that was basically it. That was his farewell. They gave him he saluted the fans, gave a speech. Also, during these 3 retirement matches, he was introducing his son, El Hijo de Santo. After that, there was, like I said earlier, Arena Mexico, EMLL had worked out a deal with UWA and they were now working together. And UWA held a show in Arena Mexico on September 5th, 1982. And he was yet in another tournament where he teamed up with Gran Amada and wrestled Scorpio and Villano Primero. He was honored prior to the match, and he actually, after the match, hugged his opponents. And again, he also introduced his son in this match as well during this his farewell. The big match that came about that we're going to talk about came on September 12th, 1982 at the Toreo de Cuatro Caminos. This was the big building, huge event. They actually made a video of this show where they basically have El Santo doing an interview prior to the show, and he gets interviewed. They have his son, El Hijo El Santo, with him. Gori Guerrero is with him. Doral Dixon is with him. I think one of the promoters, I think Francisco Flores also is involved in that. A couple of other people are also involved. And in it, El Santo's talking about his career and whether or not, talks about leaving. He's not leaving the business bitterly. He's leaving. He's sad that he's leaving, but at the same time, he thinks it's the right time to leave. Of course, at this point, I think he was in his 60s. So, but this was actually a really big show. The lineup was really loaded. When you just look at the fact that obviously Santo was the big main event, but the undercard on the show really loaded. In the opening match, you had Brazo de Oro and Brazo de Plata going up against Black Terry and Lobo Rubio. I mean, just think about that as an opening match. The second match is Irma Gonzalez defending the UWA women's title against Lola Gonzalez. The third match has Enrique Vera, George Takano, Kiss wrestling Anibal, Chaos, and Scorpio. The fourth match has Connect teaming up with Fishman and Babyface, going up against Gran Amada, Kunyaki Kobayashi, and Ricky Choshu. So that just tells you right there, I mean, the level of stars, and we're just at the the undercard of this match. The main event, El Santo teamed up with El Solitario, Gori Guerrero, and Huracan Ramirez, and they actually beat El Signo, Negro Navarro, Tejano, and Pero Guayo. And this match, if you have not seen the retirement match, it is a spectacle. I think I would compare it to if some of the more recent, if you want to talk about more recent matches, probably the Alley Park Roosh matches from a few years ago, where they were just like, you couldn't even describe it just as a a match that you base it on star ratings or anything. You just describe it as just being a spectacle, because you're just watching everything that's going on from the moment everybody enters the ring. Prior to the match, they have a little bit of a ceremony. Actually, it's a very long ceremony because the fans even start whistling. Whistling in lucha in Mexico basically means that the fans have grown tired and they want you to start wrestling, and that actually happens. I think the introductions and the ceremony actually goes about 15-20 minutes, and a lot of people are in the ring, honoring El Santo. One of the highlights for me was Los Misioneros actually gave El Santo a Misioneros de la Muerte t-shirt, which I thought was really cool. Also very funny because, thanks to him, they basically became this big act and got to be a main event, trio. But the match, once the bell rings, the match is amazing, a spectacle, a wild brawl. Everybody just going after each other. You have the Rudo trio quartet, actually, the Rudo quartet of Los Misioneros and Paraguayo being very aggressive against their much more experienced technical rivals. Really, the one guy who kind of can handle himself at that level, where you can see he could still go and he was still capable of just matching these guys as far as being aggressive, is really El Solitario. But the other three are more of they're more of they stick to being more brawling, and it's a wild brawl in and out of the ring. The first fall, it's just wild. At one point, Paraguayo, the Misioneros and Paraguayo take off El Solitario's mask, and you have El Solitario running to the back to get another mask. So he's gone as the match is coming to an end. The first fall is coming to an end, and they ended up getting DQ'd because they removed Solitario's mask, but the brawl continued, and Solitario came back with another mask and continued to brawl. He actually hit a really cool tope in the second fall. The match actually only goes two falls because Aguayo ends up fouling Santo in the second fall for the DQ. Both falls are just Rudo's losing via DQ. Wild brawl. The match, like I said, it's on YouTube. Actually, one of the YouTube channels that had it originally, they lost their channel, which was really unfortunate. So I actually ended up finding it on another YouTube channel. I think there's two or three other channels that have this show. I'll put a link up on this, and it is definitely. I highly recommend you watch it. It's fun. It's memorable. I would say as far as retirement farewell matches, it's up there with Terry Funk's retirement in Japan. His first one. I think I think Terry Funk retired a few times, but this is really good. El Santo ends up the end of it is really. I mean, even when the match ends, they all continue to brawl. You have El Santo being escorted out of the venue just because it's so packed. So many people are there, and they take him to the back. But you still have Gory Guerrero, El Solitario, Huracan Ramirez. I think Huracan Ramirez left at one point. They're still brawling with the Misioneros and Paraguayo. Then you have a few other people getting involved. You have Javier Yanez gets involved, and he kind of confronts Paraguayo. Paraguayo actually challenges El Santo and Solitario to mask versus hair matches. Just a wild scene, crazy brawl everywhere. Like I said, the Javier Yanez gets attacked. I think a few other people kind of get attacked, and like I said, just wild. I definitely recommend you guys watch it. After that match, pretty much, you don't really hear from El Santo. You really hear about him, just because, El Santo's a legend and you're always going to hear about him and you're going to see him on shows and see him everywhere. But what ends up happening is that his final appearance would come about in 1984, early 1984. I think it was in January of 84. He actually does an appearance on the TV show Contrapunto, which is a news debate show, and hosted by Jacobo Sabudowski, another legend in Mexico from that era. And that is, for those who have never seen the Contrapunto TV show, that is best remembered for El Santo removing his mask for a brief period of time, which was the only time he ever removed his mask in public. And it ends up being like this big story as far as that moment. But what a lot of people forget about that show is that it's also a very good debate show where they talk about lucha libre, whether it's tumbling, a circus, theater, or sport. And all of them, I think Wolf Ruvinsky was the one that put it best, where he said it's all four things if you really want to look at it. Wolf Ruvinsky is one of the lucha libre legends, and Santos on it, Blue Demon, Mocho Cota. There's a couple of reporters on it. One who's against lucha libre, and another one who actually covers lucha libre. And there's a lot of features on it, including a lot of some very rare interviews with some of the Lucharoth family members, like Chavo Lucharoth II is on there. I think Paco doesn't show up on that. I think Paco showed up. I think the following month he does an interview with Dr. Alfonso Morales, but it's a very memorable show, and that kind of brought El Santo back into the conversation of that was a big discussion about El Santo during that time period. Unfortunately, on February 5th, 1984, El Santo would pass away at the age of 66. A lot can be said about El Santo. There's so many. I mean, I've been looking through a lot of old lucha magazines, and one of the things that I noticed is that I don't remember which one of the magazines, it might have been Boxy Lucha. They were doing a history of El Santo's career, and I think one of the last issues that I saw from like around 81, they actually had part like 46 or something of looking back at the career of El Santo. And I think this goes back to like the 1970s. So you're talking about like them doing unfortunately, I don't even know if like we have all those issues as far as from all the people who collect Lucha Libre magazines. I don't know if there's enough. I don't know if everyone, if we all put all our magazines together, I don't know if everybody has like every single part of that. But I think the very first one I saw that was recapping the El Santo career might have been in the early 70s. So that's something that I think at some point I'll probably do like a whole history of El Santo, his career, because he was in a lot, not just as a wrestler, but he was also in movies. He dabbled in other aspects of entertainment, including doing the escapist act. So he was very interesting, a very intriguing wrestler. And whenever people talk about lucha libre legends or wrestling legends, at the very top of the list, the name that everybody talks about is El Santo. Younger generations of fans may not be too familiar with him because, fortunately, you kind of like get into wrestling, and the wrestling that you get into, those kind of become the guys that you see as the big superstars or legends down the road when you're a little older. But when you go back and you look at the entire history of pro wrestling, you have to put El Santo up there. I would say he's one of he's definitely the biggest star in the history of Mexico in lucha libre. But as far as pro wrestling, I would say he would have to be one of in that, within that top 5, top 10 group, just because his name, it's not only something that gets brought up within lucha libre, but it's also been brought up in pop culture. It's within the Mexican culture that you see if you're going to see something that's a decoration that's mask related, odds are it's going to be El Santo, be it official or unofficial merchandise. That's the odds are it's going to have El Santo or Blue Demon, someone like that, Black Shadow, guys like that. So, like I said, his last 2 years in pro wrestling, as far as that, what he was doing outside of pro wrestling, were very interesting. I hope people enjoyed this. I do kind of want to do this a little more often, as far as looking back at different wrestlers' careers, because it's a fun thing to do. But I thought this was really cool just because I could just review the match itself, but really, like I said, it's mostly just a wild brawl, and the ceremony prior to it is amazing, and the crowd reaction to it is amazing. But I also wanted to give like a more detail as far as what was leading up to his retirement, his farewell match. And like I said, on his way out, he pretty much created one of the legendary trios in Los Misioneros de la Muerte. Not by his own, it wasn't so much because of him, more because of what happened to him, that this group, and a lot of wrestlers, a lot of times it's not necessarily somebody else putting you over. It's just sometimes the circumstances within a match, suddenly you're just, or something happens and you're given that opportunity, and you become a star. I think that's what happened to Los Misioneros de la Muerte. That's it for this episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Retro Wrestling YouTube channel. And for more, check out retrowrestling.com. We will be back again very soon.